All right, we're ready for Psalm 126, 127, and 128. These are part of the Songs of Ascent, and they also, we'll come back to that here in a second, these fit into the last book of the Psalms, which primarily deals with the Word of God, which will carry us from 107 to 150, and that's where we are. This and the next two slides are just a review of what we've talked about each time concerning the Songs of Ascent. Perhaps someone may not have been here, but just a reminder, we're still in that section where these are labeled by the text, in the Hebrew text at least, as Songs of Ascent. There are 15 such songs. What does it mean they're songs of degree or ascent? Haley, I think, captured the best thought when he said various explanations have been suggested for their use and arrangement, none of which is satisfactory. It is impossible now to know definitely. And I think he's right about that. These very well may be, as we have suggested, songs that were used in their pilgrimage to the annual feast, to the three annual feasts. Some have suggested probably not that, but it may have reference to just general ascent or the general concept of progression in thought. I do not agree fully with Scroggie, though it's worthy of consideration that these probably fit in the time of Hezekiah, and the 15 are based upon 15 years of his life being extended. But that's for what you want to consider, that you can weigh that out. 10 of these are anonymous, 4 attributed to David, and 1 is to Solomon. Which one is attributed to Solomon? 127 is the only one attributed to Solomon. The other 2 tonight are going to be anonymous. The temple seems to be standing in some of these psalms, and yet there's the presence of an enemy in most of these. By the temple standing doesn't mean that it's finished, depending on our dating of these psalms, or even whether they fit in the post-exile period. We'll say more about that when we get to some of these other psalms. So let's go to Psalm 126 now. It is obviously a song of ascent, so we don't really need to spend much time on the type of psalm. It fits into that type of psalm and all the way through Psalm 134. We already know the author is anonymous. We don't know who the author is. So let's move on to the message. What is the message or the thought of Psalm 126? Yeah, thanksgiving for the return, and seemingly also a plea for complete restoration. Now that's an interesting thought, and that helps me to agree more with the idea that this is probably in the post-exile period, though could it fit in the day of Hezekiah, as Scroggie suggests? Maybe, but I want to think it fits more in the post-exile period. In that it talks about this concept of we having been restored, and yet we want more restoration. More about that in a second. Leupold suggests that this psalm has a warmth and a depth of confidence all its own. And it does have a depth and warmth of confidence all its own. It does seem to give thanksgiving for the return from exile, and I take that to be Babylonian exile, if this is the post-exile period. And this is one of the things, and maybe that's circular reasoning, but this is one of the passages that would seem to point toward the post-exile period because they've returned from some type of exile, seemingly. But there is a plea for complete restoration. I think an understanding, our studies in Haggai and our studies in Zechariah may help us a little bit. Though others want to put it just a little bit later in the post-exile period, maybe Nehemiah. Either one would fit the concept. And so what are we talking about? You remember how they came back into the land and they started rebuilding the temple, for example, and then through government interference, Cambyses brought it to a stop, and so they quit that for a number of years. And that's when Haggai comes on the scene, build the temple, and Zechariah, build the temple, and then finally the temple is finished. So they are returning, they are restored back into the land, but complete restoration hasn't taken place. Well, in the days of Nehemiah, let's go just a little bit further in time. In the days of Nehemiah, the temple has been rebuilt. Ezra and Nehemiah. The temple has been rebuilt, but what's laying in ruins? The wall is laying in ruins, and it needs to be restored. And you see the ruins that are laying waste in chapter 1 of the book of Nehemiah, and chapter 2 as well, when Nehemiah encouraged the people, let us rise up and build. Well, with that in mind, that they've come back, they've been restored to the land, but there's not complete restoration. You have, as Leupold suggests, a statement with one breath saying we have been restored, and with the same breath, there's the plea for more restoration. We've come back to the land, we've been restored to our land, but complete restoration hasn't taken place. So that's why I call this Thanksgiving for the return from exile and a plea for complete restoration. Three things happen in this psalm. Verses 1 to 3, verse 4, and then verses 5 to 6. There's the joy of the return, then there's this plea for complete restoration, and then there's the assurance of restoration and blessings that are coming. And so let's talk about how that fits the time period, and then we'll look at the psalm. But before we do that, I want to talk about some parallel in our own day and time. In the time period, as we've already mentioned, they've come back into the land, maybe started building. The foundation of the temple has been laid, but they're not done. And things are in ruins. And so here is a plea for complete restoration. Or the same thing in the days of Nehemiah. Or maybe there has been the complete restoration of the city and the walls, but the heart of the people has not been completely restored. And we see that was part of the work of Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra particularly along that line. Do you see any parallels to our own day and time of being restored, and yet there's more restoration that's needed? What about somebody that's been out of service for years? They've been a Christian, they've been faithful, they've been out of service for years, they've forgotten a lot of scriptures, they have been unfaithful in their attendance, they've and they suddenly come to a knowledge, I've been wrong, and they are restored. And so when they come back that Lord's Day and they have been restored, are they restored back in a right relationship with the Lord? Oh, sure. There's a lot to rejoice over. Is there more work to be done? You bet. There's some growth. There is some knowledge to be gained. There is some increasing in the knowledge and the grace of the Lord, etc. Make sense? So there's much parallel to this psalm. So let's start with verses 1 to 3. Let's talk about the joy of the return. So he said, when the Lord brought back the captivity of Zion, we were like those who dream. What does that suggest to you? A dream come true. Yeah, again, Leupold suggests the psalm strikes a note of strong comfort and encouragement. This is what we've been waiting on. The people coming back, many of them were born in captivity. And they were dreaming of going to the land that their ancestors had told them of. And so we've come back. Then our mouths were filled with laughter and our tongue was singing, suggesting the rejoicing and the shouting. Then they said among the nations, this is interesting. It was said among the nations, the Lord has done great things for them. What does that suggest to you? Absolutely. Let's go to Isaiah 52 and in verse 10. This is God redeeming Jerusalem, God restoring Jerusalem, the deliverance and the suffering of Jerusalem, and then it ultimately talks about the Messiah. But the Lord has made bare his holy arm in the eyes of all the nations, and the ends of the earth shall see the salvation of our God. That when God restores his people, the nations take note of that. That is, the heathen nations, the Gentiles, they take note of what's going on among God's people. And they said that, let me get my wording here, verse 2, the Lord has done great things for them. Then he turns around and the psalmist makes that same statement himself. This is what the Gentiles were, and so if this were in a play form, the Gentiles would be over here shouting, the Lord has done great things for them. Now the author of the psalm says what at verse 3? The Lord has done great things for us, and we are glad. And I take all of that to refer to the deliverance from Babylonian captivity. You say, I don't think it fits that period. It fits Hezekiah. Plug it in with Hezekiah. I'm not going to argue that point. If you think it fits in Nehemiah's time, that's post-exile, or you think it fits in Haggai's time, that's post-exile. Wherever you think it fits, plug it in there and try to make it work. I can't be dogmatic, but I want to think it's Babylonian captivity from which they have returned. And this is a dream come true. And we've been waiting for this. We've been longing for this. And so we shout with joy and with thanksgiving. All right. Now let's get to verse 4. Verse 4 said, now this one is difficult because of translation. And so as I read my translation, yours may read different. Hang on with that just for a moment. We're going to give several and talk about that. Bring back our captivity. I'm reading from the New King James, one of the New King James. Remember, it's updated every year. So you've got a New King James that reads different. Don't get excited. Yours is either older or newer than mine. But anyway, here's what it says. Bring back our captivity, O Lord, as the streams in the south. And so what on earth does that mean? Well, let's go to the slide. Here's the point I think it's making. I'm going to try to justify that from some translation. I think it's a plea for complete restoration. We've come back to the land. Oh, we're so excited, verses 1 to 3. But completely restore us. What would that include? Well, completely building the temple, completing the walls, completing the law in the hearts of the people. Complete restoration. But bring back our captivity. That seems a little obscure. The English Standard said, restore our fortunes. Perhaps a little clearer. Another translation said, turn again our captivity. That's the King James and the American Standard. That one makes more sense to me. Turn again our captivity. In other words, it's like we have been delivered from captivity, turn again us from captivity. Does that make sense? We've been delivered from captivity, deliver us again from, well, they're not back in captivity, but the fact the temple may be laying in ruins and hasn't been completed is that part of the captivity needs to be restored. The walls are lying flat. That needs to be restored. The heart of the people needs to turn again to the law of God. That part needs to be restored. Those are all a result of the captivity. Let's see, another translation said, return our prisoners again, New Century Translation. So, but I think it's just referring to this idea of complete restoration, bringing back complete, making total changes, complete deliverance, combined with strong hope, as one writer suggests. Now, what's interesting is the next phrase, as the streams in the south. Your translation may say something about as in the valley or the streams of Negeb, or that has reference to the dry beds of the streams in the Mideast that would often be dry for 11 months out of the year. But when the rainy season came, it would rush with torrents of rain and just overflow with water. And so here is a picture of what looks like it's dry, the streams of the south, that when blessings come, they're overflowing with blessings. So the plea here is complete our restoration that we might be like those, what seems like a dry bed where there is no water, that ultimately will be overflowing with water. Does that make sense? That it overflows with blessings, and there's going to be a total change come about. So the complete restoration of the rebuilding of all things and putting the heart of the people back with the law of God. Now that's about the best I can do with verse 4. Questions or comments? Anybody have a different translation that may help us a little bit there at verse 4? Both the first phrase and the second phrase of that psalm are somewhat difficult. All right, let's move on. Let's go to verses 5 and 6 now. Let's go to verses 5 and 6. Here we have the assurance of restoration and blessing. Those who sow in tears shall reap in joy. Now, verse 6 is going to repeat that same concept. We'll come to that in just a second. But what I'm seeing at verse 5 is an expression of strong hope and assurance. In other words, we're glad to be back. We want more and stronger restoration. And, well, as if we could interview the psalmist, now wait just a minute, do you really think this is going to happen? I am completely assured of that. Verses 5 and 6. Now, how do I know he's assured of that? Yeah, the sower is expecting a harvest and he's going to reap with joy. Even when it looks like there is no prospect of a reaping of the seed. Make sense? So let's get that. Look at verse 5. Those who sow in tears shall reap in joy. Now, how are they sowing in tears? That may have reference to the toil that's involved and the work that's involved in the sowing. I want to think more likely it has reference of sowing with very little prospects. It doesn't look like there's going to be any reaping. Maybe the ground is dry. Maybe there hasn't been the rain. Maybe there wasn't much of a crop last time. And it looks like there's not going to be much of a chance of a reaping. But he still sows in tears. That perhaps is the idea. But then when unexpectedly rain comes and it produces a crop, then he reaps in joy. He sows in tears and he reaps in joy. Now look at verse 6. He who continually goes forth weeping, bearing seeds for sowing, shall doubtless come again with rejoicing, bringing his sheaves with him. Now, verse 6 seems to expand, and what's the word I'm looking for? He begins to expand and makes a larger picture, I suppose, is what I'm looking for at verse 6 than we have in verse 5, though saying the same thing. Some have observed he continually goes forth weeping, bearing seeds for sowing. Even though, again, the prospects don't look good. He's doing so in toil and he's doing so in tears. One writer said he's grieving over the apparent hopelessness of it all, but still going forth bearing his seed for sowing, just in case. Let's bear that seed just in case there is a chance that I can bear some fruit from this. And so he goes forth doing that, and yet he shall doubtless come again with rejoicing. And when he comes back, what's he bringing with him? What's that? The crop. He brings the crop with him. So he goes forth sowing in tears, and then he brings his crop with him. That's assurance of a blessing. So we're glad to be back in the land. We are so excited. The Gentiles took note of that, and we're shouting for joy for that. Our plea is for complete restoration. Is it going to take place? Yeah, we have sown in tears, and it looks hopeless at times. But we're going to be like the person sowing in tears. We're going to come back bringing our sheaves. God's going to abundantly and richly bless us. Make sense? Yeah, who would have thought that you could take the very people who crucified Jesus and shouted, crucify him, and you preach to them and there's going to be a change? Who would have thought? Who would have thought? Good point. Lots of application of that, sowing in tears but reaping in joy. Maybe in the family, you put a lot of tears and sweat and you wonder, I don't know if it's going to do any good. I don't know if we're going to bear any fruit. I don't know if the children are going to listen or the parents are going to listen or whatever. If there's going to be any changes. I don't know if there's going to be any improvement. And yet we may come back bringing the sheaves. Make sense? Practical things you learn from Psalm 126. Good point. Good point. What else? Psalm 126.
Have faith, going out in tears, worry. You have faith.
Yeah, absolutely. A gratitude, I'm sorry?
In the way this is written, there's a gratitude expressed for what God has done for them. And I think that's why they're able to laugh and shout with joy.
Good point. Good point. Obviously, in this psalm, there's at the end, when he gets finally to the end, there's waiting for God to bless us. Just give him time. God will bless. God's going to do his part in time, and he's going to abundantly bless you. One writer, I think it was Scroggie, who suggested that this text says that, or what he learns from this text is that weeping should not hinder the sowing. I like that. Weeping should not hinder the sowing. Just because you're weeping at the moment, don't quit sowing. See, just because you're weeping, don't quit sowing in your family. Just because you're weeping, don't quit sowing in your spiritual life. Just because you're weeping, don't quit sowing kindness. Make sense? Don't let the weeping hinder the sowing. Good point.
In Galatians 6 and verse 9, Paul says, let us not grow weary while doing good, for in due season we shall reap if we do not lose heart.
Good connection. Very good. Anything else on Psalm 126? Thanksgiving for the return from the exile. If the assumption, and there is some degree of assumption, that these songs of ascent mean that they're singing them as they make their annual journey, and particularly in the post-exile period, I can see this one being very fitting in that post-exile period as they're making their way to Jerusalem, and maybe things are still not what they ought to be in Jerusalem, and this song to be sung, we're glad to be back, but plead for greater restoration, and we are sure it's going to happen, and that would be some encouragement. All right, anything else before we leave this psalm and go to the next? All right, let's go to Psalm 127. We are very familiar with parts of this, and you've heard it quoted many times, and you've quoted it. The author is Solomon, the only one of these. Psalm 72 is another that he authored. Have I got that right? Yeah, Psalm 72. But this is the only one of the songs of ascent that he authored. And so this is Solomon. Message of this psalm. The point of this psalm. All right. Unless the Lord build the house, they labor in vain who build it. The main thrust is, tied with that phrase, that prosperity and blessings come from Jehovah God. And God is to be credited for that. Now, does Psalm 128 fit with that? Yes. But hang on, we'll get there and we'll see how that fits. There is some dependency upon man, that man do his part of fearing God, Psalm 128. But we're forgetting that for a moment and just focusing on blessings coming from God. And so the point of the psalm is everything depends upon God's blessings. We're dependent upon the blessings from God. He talks about three different areas. Building a house. He talks about guarding a city. And then he talks about the household, the family. And then he's going to adapt to the family and talk about that in Psalm 120. I say it's not the same writer, I don't take, unless that could be. But I take the compilation of these Psalms, that one was thrown in right next to it because it also deals with the family, is what I meant to imply by that. But anyway, this deals with prosperity, comes from Jehovah. All right, now let's see what happens in the Psalm. There are basically two things in the Psalm. There is, first of all, the blessings are from the Lord, verses 1 and 2, and then 3 to 5, the blessings. But there's a lot to learn from this psalm. So let's work our way through it and see what practical things we can take home with us. Only 5 verses here. Unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain who build it. Now that's not all the verse, but the rest of the verse is a second thought. So what's his point? I think his point is success depends upon more than hard labor an honest endeavor, it depends upon the Lord. Now, we'll come back to the rest of that verse in just a second. If I might quote from Leupold, he said, industrious and hardworking people who enjoy good health and strength especially need to be taught this, lest they fall into self-sufficiency. I say amen to that. Pretty good point. That when we work hard and we're doing well and building, you may not be building a literal house, but whatever it is that you do, it might be a company, it might be a business, you might be successful at whatever hobby you have. But you put a lot of hard work into it and it turns into a success. We need a dose of Psalm 127 because it's saying unless the Lord's got his hand in it, you can just forget it. Does that make sense? Blessings and prosperity and success come from God. And that's the point he's learning. So unless the Lord build the house, they labor in vain who build it. The second illustration, verse 1b, what's it? Yeah, unless the Lord guards the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. So here's the watchman watching over the city. So whether it's building the house, some have tried to make this a progression of thought. Maybe it is. I'm not necessarily seeing that clearly, that you have the building of the house and then the houses make up the city, and then he goes back to the families within that city. Maybe. I'll leave that for you to decide. But, so here is the guarding of the city and a watchman watching over it. Unless the Lord is watching and the Lord's hand is in that, then that's all in vain. Now, let's get to verse 2. Verse 2, it is vain for you to rise early, to set up late, to eat the bread of sorrows, for he gives his beloved sleep. Now, there's a mouthful that on the surface may seem a little obscure. And so let's see if we can make some sense of that. Is this verse saying it is useless for you to be an early riser and get on to the task and to stay up late to get your work done? The answer is no. It's not what it's saying. In fact, are there not proverbs that talk about rising early? The prophets rose early. Remember that? I don't think that meant they got up before, but it's the idea they got busy to the task. They didn't delay. But it's a parallel to rising up early, one who doesn't sleep all day. In fact, the sluggard is condemned all through Proverbs. So that's not what he's talking about. So what is he saying when he says it's vain for you to rise early and to set up late?
He goes on to say, even the bread of anxious toil. It's when God is not in it, when it's the first part of it, and you're anxious and not putting burden on him and let him carry that, then you're not going to do what you're doing. But someone that is his child, he gives rest to that person, and they can rest in peace and not be anxious.
All right. All right. That's, and I think that's part of the idea here, is that anxiety, because man thinks, quite often man thinks, I don't need God's blessings, I don't need God's anything from God, I've got this on my own. And perhaps that's the idea here. I think his point is it's useless to labor if I think I don't need the blessings from God. It's absolutely useless. It doesn't do you any good to rise up early or to stay up late. And so I'm going to work late into the night, or I'm going to get up early in the early hours of the morning. That's all useless. And to eat the bread of sorrows, that is to work hard and to be anxious about all of that. For so I've lost my place. Verse 2, for so he gives his beloved sleep. Now there's perhaps two ideas of thought there. I'm going to quote from Scroggie and also Leupold. I'll take Leupold first. Leupold translates that himself, as often commentators do, make their own translation and then comment on their translation, that he will give what is right to his beloved while he sleeps. I want to read that again. Leupold thinks that this is the point. If it's not, then reject this. But I think he's got a point here. That God gives to his beloved what is right while the beloved sleeps. He gives what's right, meaning God will determine the measure and God's going to determine the time It's entirely in his hand, but he's going to do so while man sleeps, meaning that it's not dependent upon man. Man's not being active. This is without regard to man's participation. God will bless him with sleep. God will bless him with his productivity. God will bless him with his blessings while man sleeps. In other words, he's not dependent on man doing all the work. Does that make sense? So going back to this idea of prosperity is from the Lord. The Lord's got his hand in that. He needs his God to bless him. Scroggie takes a different view of that, not contradictory, but just a little different twist of that. And he thinks the idea that sleep is as much a necessity and a gift from God as man's opportunity to work. And so God will bless the man who works hard, but God will also bless him with sleep. I think perhaps Loophole's got a better idea of that, but I pass those on for what that may be worth to you. But I think the thrust of verses 1 and 2 is prosperity comes from God. The man that thinks he doesn't need God, I don't need anything from God, I don't need God, I'm doing this on my own, then he's in vain. It's all useless. Make sense? All right, let's talk about the blessing here, how he's blessed. His children are, and notice this, you might underline the word heritage from the Lord. The fruit of the womb is his reward. Heritage and reward. What does the idea of heritage suggest? It's a term used in the Old Testament to refer to an inheritance, even referring to the land of promise. That was their heritage. Say again? It's a blessing, yeah. It's an inheritance, it's a blessing, it's an unconditional, undeserved, it's not unconditional, but undeserved blessing. They don't deserve the land of promise, they don't deserve their inheritance. And so children are an inheritance from the Lord. In other words, the Lord gave the children. They're a blessing from God. And the fruit of the womb is a reward. God rewards them. Now he illustrates that at verse 4, like the arrows in the hand of the warrior, and so are the children of one's youth. What's his point? A warrior without a weapon, he's doomed, yeah. He's not very productive. He's missing something. And so it is with a mighty man who doesn't have an arrow. A soldier without a weapon in his hand is not much soldier as far as doing the job the soldier's to do. So likewise, a man without this blessing or offspring is missing something in his life. So, verse 5, happy is the man whose quiver is full of them. What's that about? Yeah, and he's well blessed, but he shall speak with them, let me get my wording here, but he shall speak with their enemies in the gate. What does that suggest to you? Man who's blessed with children is not just talking about the time of period where they're young, and he's blessing to have these young ones around him, and that keeps him active and keeps him moving and operating and but they're going to grow up.
In the Old Testament, a lot of times it talks about being in the gate is where the wise men are and where they're able to go and impart wisdom when needed for different circumstances. And now he's standing in front of his foes and being able to not only to deal with the situation wisely.
Yes. The gate is where much of the transaction of business, court, etc. took place. And notice the wording of that at verse 5. I think what Diane is saying is correct. That happy is the man who has his quiver full of them, who has a number of children. They shall not be ashamed, but shall speak with their enemies in the gate. He's reared them well enough that they can contend with their enemies and stand for the cause and stand for what's right and contend at the gate where there is much discussion. Does that make sense? And so he's proud of his family. And so prosperity comes from the Lord. Whether you're building a house or guarding a city or raising a family, you need the Lord's blessings upon you. And when you are blessed by the Lord's going to bless you richly And one of the blessings is to have children and to raise them properly and watch them converse at the gate. Make sense? Watch them stand on their own 2 feet. That's a joy. There's no greater joy than to know that your children walk in truth. Found in verse 4 of 2 John and basically 3 John. Similar phrase used in both books. All right. Practical things you learn from Psalm 127. Yes, ma'am.
If you take the idea that's in the first part of the chapter, that God has to be involved, then you're coming down to verse 4, and he's referring to this man as a warrior. It's not just any man, it's a warrior. This is someone that's got God in his life, he's secure in that, he's knowledgeable about it, and he's ready and prepared himself to handle the weapon that he's being charged with, his arrows, his children. And I think that's a powerful reason why he's able to do what he does in verse 5, having sit in the first or stand against the foes of the gate.
All right, good point. Good point. What else do we learn? We're going to get to Psalm 128 in a moment.
Something you stressed a lot, the foundation that you build upon matters. The Lord's not involved in that foundation and it's going to be weak.
Absolutely. Good point. Yeah, build the right foundation. Make sure the Lord's involved. Haley observed at this juncture, he said that we need to trust in the Lord more than in fussy activity. That's his phrase. Think about that for a moment. What else? Let's get one more practical lesson. Good point. Unless God approves, it's not worth doing. We'll end that psalm on that note and let that sink in because that's a good point to reflect on. Let's go to Psalm 128 now, and the author is, it's a song of ascent. Stephen hit the forward arrow back there. Quit working for some reason. Can't help me. We'll get that in a moment. It'll get going. It is a song of ascent. It is an anonymous psalm. What is the psalm about? Blessing of those that fear the Lord. Good analogy. I want us to start with the fear of God found in verse 1 and verse 4. There's 2 sections to this psalm. And there we go. Prosperity of those that fear God, particularly family. That's as far as I need to go right there because that's going to do it. All right. 2 sections to this. This is the prosperity of those that fear God. Now this psalm differs from Psalm 127 in that Psalm 127 shows how all blessings are attributed to God, but Psalm 128 is showing that man is responsible for fearing God to bring about the blessings. Does that make sense? Shows a condition upon which that psalm is based. Now, let's talk about verse 1 and then verses 4 to 6. Those who fear God are blessed. And so he said, blessed is everyone who fears the Lord. And then here's a qualifying phrase of what it means to fear God. I'm always fascinated with the phrase fear of God when the context defines for me. What did the context just tell me? He walks in his ways. If you fear God, you walk in the ways of God. Now drop down to verse 4. Behold, thus shall the man be blessed who fears the Lord. So in only 6 verses, he had to repeat it again. That was a needed emphasis. Man is blessed who fears God. And so we see at verse 6, I'm going to skip part of verse 6 because we're going to come back to it later. Peace be upon Israel. That's pronouncing a blessing. May a blessing be upon Israel. So those who fear God are richly blessed. And so it seemingly, I don't know that these are the same author because they're not identified as being both from Solomon. But in compiling these, this seems to have been thrown in right here because it talks very similar to Psalm 127 about prosperity and children and family. So let's see what the blessings are. The blessings are, starting at verse 2, he will eat of the labor of his hands. What does that suggest? The one that fears God, God's going to bless them with He's going to reap what he sows. Abundance. He's going to have to be blessed. What about Matthew 6? Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. These things, daily necessities, be added. That's the same promise right here. So he's going to eat of the labor of his hands. God expects you to work with your hands. Verse 2 also said, you shall be happy, and it shall be well with you. That reminds me of Deuteronomy 6, that if they would fear God, then it would be well with them. In other words, it's going to go well with you in the land. Things are going to go quite well if you just walk in the fear of God. So, it's going to go well with you. You're going to be happy. You're going to eat of the labor of your hands. Verse 3, what does he say about a wife? Like a fruitful vine. What does that suggest? Going to have children. That's the idea. And so the wife will be like a fruitful vine in the very heart of your house. Loophole suggests, I'll pass it for what it's worth. You may reject it, that's fine. But that he refers to the wife in the house because that's primarily where her work takes place. Not that she cannot do things outside, but that's where the majority of her role takes place. Your children, like olive plants all around your table. And the idea of the olive plant, as it begins to grow and the vine begins to grow, then all around your table you're surrounded with children. I like what Loophole suggests here. He said it's especially evidence concerning God's richly blessing a man as he sits around the table at meal times and he sees his family around the table. Good point. So there's children all around the table. Verse 6 implies what? He's going to have grandchildren. For he said, happy is the man. Well, I've lost my. Yes, you shall see your children's children. And I don't think it's just the fact that part of the blessing is having a wife and having children and then having grandchildren, but it's seeing the blessing of the next generation walking in the fear of God. Because this is the context. And so there is joy when you see your children walking in truth, and then when you see your children lead their children to walk in truth, and they walk in the fear of God, there is great blessing that's involved in watching the next generation. Now, time is about gone. Let's move on to practical things in Psalm 128.
One commentary said, Donnie, truly holy means to be truly happy.
All right. Good point. True happiness and true holiness go hand in hand. What else? Take home with you. Good point. What else you take home with you? Psalm 128. In connection with what was just said, we often take Psalm 127, 128 together. This is not a common thing, but it is not unheard of even Christians who talk about their children, particularly as they get into teenage years, as if their children are a nuisance rather than a blessing. Children are a heritage of the Lord. The man and woman are blessed who have children, who have grandchildren. They're not a nuisance. They are a blessing from God. What else? Quickly get one more. One more practical thing. Say again? Yeah. All right. We'll stop at that. Psalm 126, 27, and 28.